My friends think you're not really good enough for me anymore. Ethan said it while cutting into a 12-ounce ribeye at a crowded steakhouse in downtown Arlington like he was commenting on the weather. His sister laughed first. A short little laugh behind her wine glass. Then his mother looked at me and said, "Claire, sweetheart, maybe military life made you a little too cold for marriage." I remember the exact sound my fork made hitting the plate. Sharp, metallic, small enough that nobody else noticed. Ethan leaned back in his chair and shrugged. "I'm just being honest. Ryan says I could probably do better if I stopped settling." The table went quiet for half a second. Long enough for humiliation to settle into my chest like wet concrete. I looked at my husband of 11 years. At the man whose graduate school loans I paid while he slept beside me every night, believing he'd built himself alone. Then I smiled softly and said, "Then go find someone else." His mother blinked. Ethan laughed awkwardly like I was joking. But I wasn't. If this story truly resonates with you, only if it speaks to your heart, I'd really appreciate you liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing where you're watching from, along with your local time right now. I always read the comments late at night, and it reminds me I wasn't as alone as I felt back then. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 38 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and this was the dinner that quietly destroyed my marriage long before either of us admitted it was over. Looking back now, I think the worst part wasn't what Ethan said at dinner. It was how normal it felt to everyone else at that table. The drive home took 27 minutes. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while Ethan scrolled through his phone in the passenger seat like nothing had happened. "You embarrassed me tonight?" he finally muttered without looking up. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "By saying 4 words? By making things awkward." He sighed heavily. "Claire, you know how my friends are. They think you're intense. You don't exactly fit in." I stared at the red taillights ahead of us glowing through the rain. "Your friends don't know me." "Maybe that's the problem," he replied quietly. When we got home, he went upstairs without another word. I stayed in the kitchen, standing in complete silence beside the coffee maker I bought during my second deployment bonus 8 years earlier. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown Washington, D.C. number. I answered immediately. "Colonel Whitmore," the voice said, low and professional. "The acquisition transfer has been approved. Monday morning. Full amount." I closed my eyes for one long second. Upstairs, I could hear Ethan laughing on the phone with someone. Probably Ryan. Probably telling him how dramatic I'd been at dinner. Neither of them knew that by Monday morning, everything they thought they understood about me was going to collapse. The truth is, I grew up learning how to disappear before I ever learned how to fight back. My father was a Marine. My mother taught second grade at a public school outside Norfolk, Virginia, and our house always smelled faintly like coffee, old paperbacks, and furniture polish. We were not poor, but every dollar had a purpose. My older brother Daniel played varsity baseball and hung his trophies above the fireplace like little gold reminders that he mattered more. I was the quiet daughter who folded laundry without being asked and ironed my father's uniforms before inspections. "Claire's the easy one," my mother used to say to neighbors with a tired smile. "She never needs anything." I remember being 14 years old, standing in our kitchen wearing my junior ROTC uniform, while Daniel opened acceptance letters to colleges everyone celebrated like he had personally cured cancer. My father shook his hands so hard their coffee spilled across the table. "That is my boy," he kept repeating proudly. I stood there holding a tray of biscuits nobody touched. Later that night, my father looked at my uniform and sighed. "Military life is hard on women, Claire. You sure you do not want something simpler?" I still remember how small I felt hearing that. Not angry, just quietly dismissed. Ethan was the first person who ever made me feel seen. We met when I was 26 at a crowded coffee shop near Georgetown while I was attending a defense logistics conference. He smiled at me like I was interesting before he even knew what rank I held. Back then, he used to tell people how impressive I was. "My girlfriend runs military operations," he would joke proudly. "She probably manages more pressure before breakfast than I handle all month." Somewhere over the years, that pride faded into embarrassment, into comments about my uniforms, into little corrections about how I talked at dinner parties, into reminders not to sound too intense around his clients. The strange part is, I adapted without even noticing. Smaller earrings, softer voice, less eye contact, less of myself. Standing alone in my kitchen that rainy night, I opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and stared at the old deployment plaque tucked behind cookbooks and unopened wine glasses. Ethan had once called it my combat participation trophy during an argument and laughed afterward like it was harmless. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Washington. This one only had 4 words. Transfer scheduled for Monday. And for the first time in years, I realized I was no longer afraid of what happened next. 3 days after that dinner, I flew to Washington for what Ethan thought was another boring military conference. That was the exact phrase he used while standing in our bathroom knotting his tie. You really should think about transitioning out soon, he said casually. Nobody wants to spend their whole life around people yelling acronyms and camouflage. I remember watching him through the mirror while fastening the small silver bars on my uniform jacket. Some of us actually like serving, I replied quietly. Ethan shrugged. Sure, but eventually people move on to real money. At the time, he still believed he was the financially ambitious one in our marriage. The Pentagon meeting lasted 6 hours inside a cold conference room with no windows and terrible coffee that tasted burned even with cream. By the end of it, the acquisition deal I had spent almost 4 years quietly helping build was officially approved pending final transfer on Monday morning, 18% ownership, $4.8 million after taxes. I signed the final authorization packet with a government-issued pen while 3 defense executives shook my hand across the table. Congratulations, Colonel Whitmore, one of them said. Most people in your position would have sold years ago. I smiled politely. Most people panic too early. That night I came home exhausted, carrying my overnight bag through the front door just as Ethan's younger sister Madison walked into the kitchen holding a champagne bottle. Claire's finally back from Army camp, she joked. Ethan laughed from the couch. Be nice. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically. I am nice. I just do not understand why she works this much when Ethan is already doing well. I set my bag down slowly beside the island counter. I work because I enjoy it. Sure, Madison replied with a smirk. But Ethan's clients are moving into country clubs and lake houses, while you are still disappearing into government buildings every weekend. Ethan did not defend me. He just kept scrolling through his phone. That silence hurt more than the joke itself. Later that evening, while I unpacked upstairs, I noticed Ethan smiling at a text message, lighting up his screen on the dresser. Vanessa, again. This time there was a photo attached. A woman standing beside a luxury condo balcony holding 2 champagne glasses. Underneath it, she wrote, "Next time, you are not bringing the military wife." I stared at the message for a long moment before quietly setting his phone back exactly where I found it. Then downstairs, I heard the front doorbell ring. When I opened the front door, Ryan was standing there holding a 6-pack of beer and wearing the uncomfortable expression people get when they already know something ugly is happening but do not want to be the first to say it out loud. Hope I am not interrupting, he said carefully, stepping inside while rainwater dripped from his jacket onto the hardwood floor. Ethan immediately perked up from the couch. Perfect timing, he said. We were just talking about getting out of this depressing house for once. Ryan glanced toward me for half a second too long, enough for me to notice. Madison opened the champagne bottle in the kitchen while Ethan pulled out glasses like they were celebrating something. Vanessa got us reservations Saturday night, Ethan announced proudly. Private rooftop place in D.C. Apparently senators go there. Madison laughed. Please tell me Claire is not wearing one of her military blazers again. Ethan smirked without even looking at me. No offense, babe, but maybe this time try not to interrogate everyone at the table. They all laughed lightly after that. Casual, effortless. Like I was the running joke everybody already understood. I stood by the sink pretending to rinse a clean glass while Ryan stayed completely silent beside the island counter. Actually, Madison added while pouring champagne, Vanessa said she has a friend who would be perfect for Ethan if he was ever single again. Somebody softer, more polished. Ethan did not stop her. He just took a sip from his glass and said quietly, Yeah, well, some people grow together, and some people just stay stuck. I felt something inside me go still at those words. Not shattered. Worse, quiet. Like a door locking from the inside. Ryan suddenly set his beer down harder than he meant to. Man, maybe slow down a little, he muttered. Ethan rolled his eyes immediately. What? Everybody thinks it. Then he turned toward me for the first time all evening. Claire, you know I have worked hard to build relationships with important people. You do not exactly make things easier. I stared at him across the kitchen island. At the man whose rent I covered during his unpaid internship, the man who once cried in my arms because he thought he would never become successful. "I see," I said softly. Ethan exhaled dramatically like I was exhausting him. "Look, nobody is saying you are a bad person. You are just not—" He stopped there, but Madison finished it for him anyway. Enough for the life he wants now. The room went silent after that. Even the rain outside sounded distant. Ryan looked sick. Ethan looked annoyed. And for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I realized my husband had already rewritten our entire story in his head without telling me. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket again. I pulled it out slowly and read the message that made my stomach drop cold. Final transfer completed early. Funds available immediately. By midnight, everybody had gone home except Ethan. He stayed downstairs drinking bourbon in the living room while sports highlights flickered across the television with the volume low. I sat upstairs on the edge of our bed staring at the banking notification glowing on my phone screen. $4,812,000. Available balance updated at 11:42 p.m. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Deeply tired. Around 12:17 a.m., Ethan finally came upstairs and stopped in the doorway when he saw me still awake. "You are really going to sulk about tonight?" he asked. I looked up slowly. "That is what you think this is?" He sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead. "Claire, everybody was drinking. Madison talks too much. You know how she is." "And you?" I asked quietly. He hesitated just long enough to hurt me again. "I just think maybe we have grown apart." The room went still after that. Rainwater slid softly down the bedroom windows, while the dryer hummed faintly somewhere downstairs. Ethan sat at the foot of the bed without looking at me. "Vanessa thinks I have been carrying this marriage alone for years," he admitted carefully. "She thinks you emotionally checked out a long time ago." I almost laughed hearing that. I remembered wiring $12,000 from my deployment savings to cover his business losses 3 years earlier while he slept beside me peacefully. I remembered working overnight logistics calls from Kuwait while helping him rewrite his resume during layoffs. Carrying him had become so normal that nobody even noticed the weight anymore. The next morning, Ethan left early without kissing me goodbye. At 8:06 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message from him. "Sorry about last night. We should talk later." 10 minutes later came another one. "Ryan says things got out of hand." Then another. "You know I never meant to hurt you, right?" I stared at the messages while sitting alone in the Pentagon parking garage inside my black SUV. A few minutes later, an email notification appeared from Ethan with the subject line, "Maybe we need space." Attached was a luxury condo listing in Alexandria. 1 bedroom, rooftop gym, walking distance to downtown. I could practically hear Vanessa's influence all over it. That evening, he called 3 times. I let every call ring out into silence while sitting in my office reviewing transfer documents under fluorescent lights that made everything feel cold and unreal. Outside the window, military personnel crossed the parking lot carrying coffee cups and backpacks like ordinary life was still happening somewhere. But inside me, something had already gone numb. Not angry, not dramatic, just empty in a way that frightened me more than heartbreak ever could. 2 weeks later, Ethan moved out on a gray Thursday morning while I was at the Pentagon. He did not wait for me to come home. He did not ask to talk face to face. He left his wedding ring on the kitchen counter beside a grocery receipt and took half the closet hangers like we were dividing office supplies instead of a marriage. When I walked through the front door that night, the house felt wrong immediately. Too quiet, too clean. His coffee mug was gone from beside the sink. The throw blanket he always complained about was missing from the couch. Even the air smelled different somehow, like cold drywall and unopened rooms. My phone buzzed before I even sat down. "Ethan." I let it ring twice before answering. "Claire," he said carefully, his voice thin through the speaker. "I did not want you walking into the house like that." I stared at the empty living room while rain tapped softly against the windows again. "How considerate." He exhaled heavily. "Come on, do not do that." "Do what?" "Make me sound like the villain." I closed my eyes for a second. 11 years together and somehow he still thought this was about tone instead of betrayal. "Where are you staying?" I asked quietly. There was a pause long enough to tell me the answer before he spoke it. "Alexandria. Vanessa's condo." Of course. I nodded slowly even though he could not see me. I hope the rooftop gym was worth it. He became defensive immediately. It is not like that, but it already was. After the call ended, I walked upstairs and opened the closet door out of habit before remembering half of it was empty now. His side looked stripped bare except for one forgotten blue dress shirt hanging crookedly near the back. I touched the sleeve for a moment and suddenly remembered ironing that same shirt at 2 a.m. before one of his client dinners because he had been stressed and exhausted and I wanted to help. The memory hit harder than I expected. Not because I missed him, because I finally understood how invisible I had become inside my own marriage. Around midnight, my mother called after hearing the news from Madison. "Maybe some time apart will help," she said gently. Men get intimidated when women become too independent. I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the untouched bowl of soup I had reheated twice already. "You think this is my fault?" Silence filled the line for a second before she answered softly, "I think marriage requires softness, Claire." After we hung up, I looked around the dark kitchen and realized nobody in my life actually understood what had just happened to me. Not Ethan. Not my family. Not even me yet. Then my laptop screen lit up with a new email. Notification from Washington marked confidential, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something besides grief. Focus. The confidential email arrived at 12:43 a.m., while I was still sitting at the kitchen table wearing the same gray Pentagon sweater from earlier that day. Subject line: Strategic Advisory Position Approval. I opened it slowly, expecting another compliance document. Instead, I found a formal offer from Arlington Defense Logistics Group inviting me to join their executive advisory board after my retirement transition the following year. Compensation package attached. I stared at the number for a long moment before leaning back in my chair. It was more money than Ethan had ever earned in a single year. More than double, actually. The strange part was not the amount. It was realizing I no longer needed anyone's permission to build a life that belonged entirely to me. The next few weeks became painfully quiet. I woke up at 5:15 every morning, ran 3 miles around the base perimeter while cold Virginia air burned my lungs, then drove to work before sunrise with black coffee balanced in the cup holder beside me. No texts from Ethan, no apologies from Madison, no calls from my mother asking how I was holding up. At first, the silence hurt. Then it became peaceful. One Friday afternoon, I stopped by a small furniture store in Alexandria and bought myself a dark walnut desk for the empty home office upstairs. The salesman smiled while loading the boxes into my SUV. "New job?" he asked casually. "New life?" I answered before I could stop myself. That night, I assembled the desk alone in complete silence, except for soft jazz playing from my kitchen speaker and the occasional hum of traffic outside. Around 9:00 p.m., Ryan called unexpectedly. "Claire," he said carefully, "I probably should not tell you this, but Ethan has been talking about you constantly." I tightened the final screw on the desk drawer. "That sounds exhausting for him," Ryan hesitated. He thought moving out would make him feel successful. It did not. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked around the room Ethan used to mock as my little military workspace. Now it held investment folders, defense contracts, and acquisition documents worth more than everything he and Vanessa combined could probably imagine. "People only notice what you built after they lose access to it," I said quietly. Ryan went silent after that. Before hanging up, he muttered something strange. "Just be careful this weekend, Claire. I think Ethan is about to make a very public mistake." After the call ended, I walked toward the window overlooking the city lights scattered across Arlington and realized for the first time in months that I was no longer surviving my life. I was rebuilding it. And somewhere across the river in Washington, people with power were finally beginning to notice my name. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of sharp Virginia weather that made the air smell like metal and rain before sunrise. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, fastening the dark blue service jacket I had not worn in months. The silver oak leaves on my collar caught the light from the bedside lamp, while the fabric settled perfectly across my shoulders from years of routine and discipline. For a long moment, I just looked at myself quietly. Not Ethan's wife. Not the woman everyone kept calling cold or difficult. Lieutenant Colonel Claire Whitmore. Logistics Command. United States Army. I had spent so many years shrinking pieces of myself to make other people comfortable that I almost forgot how authority felt on my own skin. By 8:00 a.m., I was standing inside a secure conference building in Washington, surrounded by defense executives in tailored suits carrying leather folders worth more than some people's monthly rent. A young assistant near the elevator glanced at my uniform and immediately straightened her posture. "Good morning, Colonel Whitmore." I nodded politely and continued toward the boardroom where my name already waited printed neatly on a black placard at the center of the table. Claire Whitmore, Strategic Advisory Board. One of the executives from Arlington Defense Logistics crossed the room smiling the second he saw me. "There she is," he said warmly, "the woman who practically saved this acquisition." Another man laughed quietly beside him. "We have been trying to recruit her for 2 years. I accepted the handshake calmly, while coffee steamed from silver catering trays near the windows overlooking downtown Washington. Nobody here asked me to be softer. Nobody here acted embarrassed by my ambition. During the meeting, I outlined a restructuring proposal for military supply chain efficiency across 3 regional hubs, while half the room took notes. At one point, a senior consultant interrupted and asked, "How did you identify these vulnerabilities so quickly?" I answered honestly, "Because I spent 15 years solving problems nobody else noticed until they became expensive." The room went silent after that, in the good kind of way. Respectful, focused, real. When the meeting finally ended around noon, my phone buzzed as I stepped outside onto the marble entrance stairs. Ethan's name flashed across the screen for the first time in almost 4 days. I stared at it while black government SUVs rolled past the curb below me. Then another message appeared immediately after. "Claire, please answer. Something happened." And suddenly, after weeks of silence, the past came rushing back toward me all at once. By the time I reached Georgetown Memorial Hospital, the sky had already gone dark over Washington, and cold wind pushed fallen leaves across the parking garage like dry paper. Ethan's messages had become frantic during the drive. "Please come. Ryan cannot calm her down. I just need to explain." I parked on level 4 and sat in the SUV for a full minute, with both hands still gripping the steering wheel. Part of me almost turned around, but another part needed to see whatever disaster had finally broken through Ethan's perfect little fantasy life. The emergency waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant. Television screens mounted in the corners played muted news coverage, while tired families sat under fluorescent lights, pretending not to stare at each other. Ryan spotted me first near the vending machines and immediately stood up too fast. His face looked pale, exhausted. "Claire," he said quietly, walking toward me. "Thank God you came." I crossed my arms against the cold inside the lobby. "What happened?" Ryan rubbed both hands over his face before answering. "Ethan and Vanessa went to some investor event tonight in Arlington, a rooftop party. Of course they did. They were drinking," he continued carefully. "And somebody there recognized your name." My stomach tightened slightly. "Recognized me how?" Ryan hesitated. "One of the investors from Arlington Defense Logistics was there. He started talking about the acquisition deal, about you." Around us, hospital doors opened and closed with soft mechanical sounds, while a nurse pushed an empty wheelchair across the tile floor. Ryan lowered his voice. "Claire, nobody knew. Not Ethan, not Vanessa, nobody." I looked past him toward the hallway leading deeper into the hospital. "So why am I here?" Before Ryan could answer, a sharp voice suddenly cut across the waiting room. "Because your husband humiliated himself in front of half the city tonight." Vanessa stood near the elevators in a cream-colored coat with mascara streaked beneath her eyes. She looked furious, embarrassed, smaller somehow. Ethan sat slumped in a chair behind her, staring down at the floor with both elbows on his knees, like he physically could not look at me yet. For the first time in months, he looked afraid. Vanessa laughed bitterly and pointed toward me. "Do you have any idea what people were saying after they found out who you actually are?" Ethan finally lifted his head slowly then, his eyes red and exhausted. "Claire," he whispered. But before he could finish the sentence, another voice behind me spoke calmly from the hospital entrance. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore?" I turned and immediately recognized one of the senior executives from Arlington Defense Logistics, stepping into the lobby wearing a dark wool coat. And the second Ethan saw the man shake my hand respectfully, everything finally started to collapse. The executive extended his hand toward me without hesitation. "Colonel Whitmore, I was hoping I would run into you before Monday's press release." His voice carried calmly through the waiting room, while Ethan stared at us like he had suddenly forgotten how breathing worked. I shook the man's hand politely. Good to see you again, David. Vanessa frowned immediately. Press release? David glanced between us, clearly unaware he had just stepped into the middle of a collapsing marriage. The acquisition announcement, he explained casually. Claire's restructuring work is becoming one of the largest private defense logistics transitions on the East Coast this year. Nobody spoke for a second after that. Even the television noise in the waiting room seemed far away suddenly. Ethan slowly stood from the chair beside the wall. What acquisition? He asked quietly. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it before. David looked confused. Arlington Defense Logistics. Claire has been advising the board for years. Vanessa let out a short laugh like she thought this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Wait, advising? She repeated. You mean military consulting? David shook his head immediately. No, ownership. Then he smiled politely toward me again. 18% equity if I remember correctly. Ryan looked down at the floor the second the number landed in the room. Ethan's face lost color so fast it honestly frightened me a little. Claire, he whispered, staring at me now instead of David. What is he talking about? I held his gaze calmly. Exactly what you think he is talking about. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. No, that is impossible. Ethan said you worked government logistics. I do, I answered, and I invested in a private defense supply company 9 years ago when nobody else thought it would survive. David adjusted the cuff of his coat. That investment became worth approximately $4.8 million this week. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ethan sat back down slowly like his knees suddenly stopped working correctly. I watched realization move across his face piece by piece. The deployment years, the mortgage payments during layoffs, the vacations he thought he paid for, the emergency transfers when his accounts overdrafted. All those moments he never questioned because he assumed his success mattered more than mine. Vanessa looked genuinely embarrassed now. You never told anyone? She asked quietly. I almost smiled at that. Nobody asked. Ethan pressed both hands against his forehead and stared down at the hospital tile floor. Oh my God, he muttered under his breath. Oh my God. And in that moment, surrounded by fluorescent lights and strangers and the cold smell of disinfectant, my husband finally realized the woman he spent months treating like an embarrassment had quietly become the most successful person in the entire room. The waiting room changed after that. Not loudly. Nobody gasped dramatically or started shouting. It was quieter than that, more uncomfortable. Like everybody suddenly realized they had walked into the middle of a story they completely misunderstood. Vanessa stepped back first, crossing her arms tightly over her coat. Ethan told me you barely cared about money, she said carefully. I looked at her for a moment. I do not. David checked his watch politely beside us. Colonel Whitmore, I should probably let you handle this privately, he said, but congratulations again. Monday is going to be a very big day for you. Thank you, I replied calmly. After he left, nobody spoke for several seconds. Ryan finally cleared his throat softly. I am going to grab coffee. He disappeared toward the vending machines immediately, leaving the three of us standing under fluorescent lights that suddenly felt too bright. Ethan looked exhausted now, not angry, not defensive, just shaken in a way I had never seen before. Why would you hide all of this from me? He asked quietly. I almost answered immediately. Then I stopped myself because the truth deserved honesty, not emotion. I did not hide it, I said. You stopped paying attention. Ethan stared at me like the sentence physically hurt him. Vanessa looked between us awkwardly before speaking again. I should go. Ethan barely noticed her leaving. His eyes never left my face. Claire, I did not know, he said softly. I swear to God I did not know. I nodded once. That is the problem. Somewhere down the hallway, an intercom announced a doctor's name, while hospital doors opened and closed with soft mechanical sounds. Ordinary life continuing around us, while my marriage quietly collapsed in real time. Ethan stepped closer carefully, like he was afraid sudden movement might break something fragile. I thought you did not need me anymore, he admitted. You were always so controlled, so independent. I let out the smallest breath through my nose. I needed respect, Ethan. That landed harder than the money ever could have. He looked down immediately after that. I made you feel small, he whispered. I did not answer because both of us already knew it was true. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket then. Another email from Arlington Defense Logistics confirming Monday's press conference and executive dinner. I glanced at the screen briefly before locking the phone again. Ethan noticed the logo immediately. "You are really doing this," he said quietly. "You are moving on." For the first time all night, I looked directly at him without anger or sadness clouding my thoughts, just clarity. "No," I said softly. "I already moved on. You just did not notice when it happened." Ethan looked like he wanted to say something else after that, something bigger, more desperate. But before he could speak, his phone suddenly lit up with 3 incoming calls from his mother back to back, and somehow that made everything feel even sadder. 3 months later, I moved into a quiet townhouse overlooking the Potomac River just outside Alexandria. Nothing extravagant. Brick exterior, small balcony, white kitchen cabinets that caught the morning sunlight around 6:30 every day when I made coffee before work. The first night I slept there, the silence felt unfamiliar. Not lonely, just honest. There were no tense dinners, no careful editing of my personality, no waiting for someone to decide whether I was too much or not enough. I kept the house simple, one dark walnut desk in the office upstairs, my deployment plaque finally hanging on the wall instead of hidden behind cookbooks, and beside it, framed carefully in black glass, the first official Arlington Defense Logistics press release with my name printed across the bottom. Lieutenant Colonel Claire Whitmore, Strategic Advisory Board member. The Monday after the hospital incident, the acquisition announcement spread faster than I expected. Madison called twice crying and apologizing for the things she said. My mother mailed me a handwritten letter 3 pages long about how proud she had always been of me, even when she did not know how to show it. Ethan sent flowers twice. I donated the first arrangement to the hospital lobby and never opened the second card. We spoke one final time 6 weeks after everything collapsed. He met me at a quiet coffee shop near Georgetown, looking older somehow, smaller around the eyes. "I loved you," he said softly while staring into his untouched coffee. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. "I know," I answered, "but you stopped seeing me clearly a long time ago." He nodded slowly after that, like the truth finally exhausted him. Before leaving, he looked at me one last time and asked, "Do you think we could have survived this if I had known who you really were?" I thought about that question all the way home. And honestly, I think the answer is no. Because the real problem was never money. It was that somewhere along the way, I learned to make myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. And once you abandon yourself long enough, eventually the people around you start believing that smaller version is all you deserve to be. These days, I trust my instincts differently. I pay attention when something feels wrong instead of explaining it away to keep the peace. I protect my finances, my name, my peace. I have learned that love without respect slowly turns into loneliness, even when somebody is sleeping beside you every night. And if you are listening to my voice right now while carrying your own heartbreak quietly, I need you to hear this part carefully. You are not difficult for wanting respect. You are not cold for having boundaries. And you do not need to shrink your intelligence, your ambition, your success, or your spirit just to make somebody else comfortable. Sometimes God, or the universe, or whatever higher power you believe in, removes people from your life because they could no longer recognize the value of what they were holding. My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 38 years old. And the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let another person define your worth while you are busy abandoning yourself to earn their approval. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Truly, if any part of it stayed with you tonight, I hope it reminded you that healing does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like quiet mornings, locked doors, protected peace, and finally seeing yourself clearly again. If this story spoke to your heart, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what lesson stayed with you most. And if you would like to walk with me through more stories about family, betrayal, healing, and quiet strength, I would be honored if you stayed connected to this channel. Because somewhere out there tonight, somebody else is just beginning the moment their whole life changes. And in the next story waiting in this playlist, another woman will discover that the people closest to her were hiding something far more painful than betrayal. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones sitting quietly at your own dinner table, and sometimes the next story finds you exactly when you need it most.